Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, December 5th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism against people in foreign countries encouraged sotto voce by our government. At this moment, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, although most Americans are barely aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world, not Russia, China, even North Korea, or Iran? The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the accelerating profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. The American elite's concern for profits has meant that the center of attention for American foreign policy has for more than a century been Eurasia, the landmass from Eastern Europe to East Asia, rather than Western Europe or the Western Hemisphere. Since at least the end of the 19th century, the U.S. government has been determined to prevent the economic integration of Eurasia, under any power, Eastern or Western, for fear that it would hinder the economic exploitation of Eurasia by the American 1%. That's what the unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s was about, the conquering their greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. It's the Second World War. That's why the U.S. left Russia to defeat Hitler alone in 1941, so the U.S. could concentrate on Japan. In World War II as a whole, the U.S. had 500,000 casualties, but Russia lost perhaps 27 million people in defeating Nazi Germany. The bedrock of U.S. foreign policy today remains the containment of Eurasia, to Russia and China today, and retarding its economic development. The American task is more difficult today than at any time since World War II, owing to the effective alliance between Russia and China, and their alliance with other states, notably Iran and Syria. That's why the U.S. has 1,000, yes, 1,000, military bases around Russia and China, while Russia has 15 bases outside its territory, and China has 1. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the only undamaged major country on either side. U.S. government plans were described by the State Department Policy Planning Staff in a secret memorandum in 1948 that pointed out that, quote, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of the world's population. This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction." So, avoiding world benefaction from World War II up to today, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people to maintain that economic control of the world. President Obama was the first U.S. president in history to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms. In the campaign, President Trump criticized the 8 wars Obama was conducting, Obama's war provocations against Russia and China, and Obama's drone assassinations, accurately called the greatest terrorist program in modern times. But once in office, Trump has adopted Obama's war policies. Our anti-war group, AWARE, was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001 and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, which began America's longest war. The founders of AWARE saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but is in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here at home comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over Eurasian economic rivals from Germany to China. The U.S. has been at war almost continuously since World War II, putting down challenges to its economic control of the world. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It is a triumph for the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in AWARE, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations, notably Russia, China, Iran, and Syria. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, stop the drone attacks, and end the war provocations against Russia and China. 3, cut military spending by at least 50% and close the 1,000 U.S. military bases ringing Russia and China. Bring all U.S. troops and weapons home and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the countries of the world. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. Revoke the Obama administration's trillion-dollar plan to update U.S. nuclear weapons and make them more usable. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by the pro-war U.S. political establishment. We'll try to give a better account tonight. And we'll start with a comment on the series on the Vietnam War that's being run in the local fish wrap in the News-Gazette. The News-Gazette has been carrying a series of articles of experiences of people 50 years ago in Vietnam. And that's worthwhile. I mean, it's certainly part of the tradition that we should recall, but we should also understand it correctly and not in a sort of propagandistic fashion in which Vietnam is usually recalled today. There are important parallels between the Vietnam War 50 years ago and America's wars in the Middle East today. We might even contrast them as wars in Southeast Asia 50 years ago and wars in Southwest Asia today. Southeast Asia being Vietnam and surroundings. The war in Vietnam was never limited to Vietnam, but involved Laos, Cambodia, the surrounding countries, and was predicated upon the notion that the war was a way to oppose the independence of the region as a whole from American economic control. So Southeast Asian War 50 years ago and a Southwest Asian War in the Middle East and North Africa today shows some interesting parallels. It was Mark Twain who was supposed to have said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And there's a murderous rhyme between the Southeast Asian War of the 1960s and the Southwest Asian War of today. The Southeast Asian War, the Vietnam War, began in the Kennedy administration, not later, as we sometimes are told, when John Kennedy's administration attacked the South Vietnam. The war was always centered in South Vietnam because the South Vietnamese refused to accept the government that we'd picked out for them. We had a long history of picking out governments for countries in Latin America, for example, and they rarely complained, or they rarely complained in an effective fashion. But the South Vietnamese were not too interested in the government that the U.S. wanted to impose after the Second World War in South Vietnam. The Kennedy administration attacked South Vietnam, carpet bombing the country, and the result was 15 years of war that ended finally in the withdrawal of American troops from a country that they had effectively destroyed. For the Kennedy-Johnson-Nixon War in Vietnam, as we might call it, from 1962 to 1975, was the greatest international crime of the post-World War II years. 4 million people died as a result of Mr. Kennedy's war. The recent war in Southwest Asia bears, as I say, some interesting parallels with might call it the Bush-Obama-Trump war in the Mideast that began with the Bush invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 and continues in the Trump administration today. This 15 years of war is the greatest international crime so far in the current century. Our demand today should be what it was in the Vietnam War: bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, end U.S. invasions and war provocations. Instead, what we get from American liberals is hate Trump, an anti-Trump campaign which doesn't refer to the war policies which the U.S. continues to follow, grew originally out of the fact that Trump was the first major party candidate in 40 years actually to criticize the war-making of all administrations of the last 50 years. He did that and so affrighted the neocons, the neoconservative, the war party, we might say, in the U.S., that they fled the Republican Party, ran to the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton's campaign because Hillary Clinton was a reliable warmonger who would carry on the wars and war provocations of the Bush and Obama administrations. When Trump was elected, the neocons were terrified and moved heaven and earth in remarkably difficult to understand ways. I'm thinking particularly of the Russiagate nonsense, to ensure that the Trump administration would follow the same war-making policies that the previous administrations had followed. And indeed he has, or the Trump administration indeed has fallen into the standard American war against the rest of the world that we've known and loved so well since the Second World War. He's put a troika of generals in charge of American foreign policy, and the wars continue. It was a propaganda coup in part on the political establishment to focus on Trump rather than the wars. It turned aside criticism of American wars to criticism of Trump. And I thought of the line in the wonderful anti-war novel from 1973, Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, a prophetic novel in some ways, although it's ostensibly about the Second World War. In the Gravity's Rainbow, the title of the novel is the track followed by a missile, a rainbow that is determined by gravity and the firing of the missile, and it's falling on its target. So Gravity's Rainbow, which, as I say, is one of the great novels of the American 20th century, Gravity's Rainbow has one section called Proverbs for Paranoids. And one of the proverbs is, if they can get you asking the wrong question, they don't have to worry about answers. Now, it seems to me exactly the word, line that or the advice that the American political establishment is following in Russiagate and its hate Trump activities. It's if the question becomes how do we get rid of Trump, the political establishment in favor of these wars doesn't have to worry about the answer because the wars continue on apace and there is no criticism of them. The criticism is all directed against the wretched character of Donald Trump. The demonstration that the AWARE organization, our peace group, carries on the first Saturday of every month occurred this past Saturday, and I passed out at the demonstration a flyer that read as follows. President Trump is not the problem. Illegal U.S. wars around the world are. The U.S. government is today making war around the world, and it's doing so without authorization from the U.S. Constitution or the U.S. UN Charter. If American leaders were put on trial today, as German leaders were at Nuremberg after World War II for launching aggressive war, the American leaders, like the German leaders, would be hanged. The U.S. military is today killing people in 7 Mideast and African countries: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan, and on the other side of the world in the Philippines. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these countries, although most Americans don't know that. In addition, the 70,000-member U.S. Special Operations Command is active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, torture, and murder. President Obama was elected as an anti-war candidate and immediately given a peace prize. But once in office, he sent thousands of additional U.S. troops into America's longest war in Afghanistan. President Trump, who promised caution and non-interventionism in foreign policy and described Hillary Clinton, accurately, as a trigger-happy warmonger, has now done the same thing himself. Both men, Trump and Obama, knew that in spite of intense media propaganda, most Americans don't want U.S. troops engaged in foreign wars and don't see the killing as justified. Both candidates had to seem to oppose the wars in order to get elected. But the 1%, the U.S. economic elite, do want the wars. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the least damaged major country on either side and controlled the world economy. America's wars since then, in Korea, Vietnam, Latin America, and the Mideast, have killed between 20 and 30 million people for the purpose of maintaining that control. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. An Australian commentator wrote before the election, quote, "The CIA has demanded Trump not be elected. Pentagon generals have demanded he not be elected. The pro-war New York Times, taking a breather from its relentless low-rent Putin smears, demands that he not be elected. Something is up. These tribunes of perpetual war are terrified that the multi-billion-dollar business of war by which the United States maintains its dominance will be undermined if Trump does a deal with Russian President Putin and then with China's President Xi Jinping. Their panic at the possibility of the world's great power talking peace, however unlikely, would be the blackest farce were the issues not so dire." Close quote. In fact, what has happened in the years since Trump's election is that he has been thoroughly tamed to the war policies of the United States that the rest of the world sees and deplores. The question of how do we get rid of Trump is, I suggest, the wrong question. The real question is, how do we stop American war making? And that's what the anti-war movement, of which our group AWARE is a part, is primarily concerned with. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 49th week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, Jamie Nicholson for research. You can see No's notes on the blog newsfromneptune.com. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scollery. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to tonight and comments by members of the group. You can also link to Aware's anti-war teach-in on YouTube, arranged by the omnicompetent Jason Liggett. We'll conclude tonight with two pieces on the shameful war in Yemen, which the U.S. is largely responsible for. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't: Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.
It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Mate. Yemen's longtime ex-president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, has been killed by his former allies, the Houthi rebels. Unconfirmed video shows militants loading Saleh's dead body onto the back of a pickup truck. Saleh was killed after breaking ties with the Houthis and calling for talks with a Saudi-led coalition that has fought the Houthis in Yemen for more than 2 years. So what does Saleh's death mean for Yemen's war? Well, earlier I spoke to Dr. Sheila Carapico, a professor at the University of Richmond and a specialist in Yemen. Dr. Carapico, welcome. Before we get into what Saleh's death means, can you talk about who he is and the important background that people should know about him?
Well, I mean, he came into power in the late 70s after two of his predecessors were assassinated, and proceeded to kind of craft a style of leadership, co-optation and manipulation. One of the high points was when he unified Yemen in 1990, but then that went awry 4 years later in 1994 when the South, former People's Democratic Republic, attempted to secede. And since then, he's been more and more Machiavellian in his way of ruling, until finally in 2011, the vast majority of young people in the country rose up to demand his removal from office.
Right, and that's when he handed off power to his vice president, right? And then ended up switching sides and allying himself with the Houthis, who ended up fighting his vice president Hadi. But now it looks as if the Houthis have just killed Saleh. So what happened here?
Well, I mean, it had been in the works apparently for a while that the Houthis and Saleh's people were not seeing eye to eye on a number of things. And then what tipped it over, and then of course he had also been negotiating with Saudi Arabia and with the United Arab Emirates, who are leading the coalition that's trying to reinstate Hadi into power. And then on Saturday, he gave a televised interview format, but basically a speech declaring that he was separating from the Houthis and willing to make peace with Saudi Arabia, which amounted to saying that he was switching sides. And I think he thought that was a very clever power move that would allow him to consolidate power against the Houthis, as well as probably other rivals, including Hadi. But then, as we learned this morning, the Houthis managed to assassinate him.
Right. Can you tell us what happened there? A quite striking video of Salah's dead body after he was killed.
I've seen more than one account, but what I believe happened is that he left his compound with a convoy of 30 or 20 or 30 vehicles, um, attempting, I guess, to leave town for reasons that are not clear to me. And they were ambushed. And a rocket propelled grenade apparently stopped his vehicle, and then he was shot at close range.
And what does this mean for the Saudi-led war on Yemen? I imagine a big part of their strategy was getting Salah on side in the hopes that that would help them crush their rivals, the Houthis. Houthis have retaliated by killing Salah. So what's next for them?
What it seems like is that they're just going to keep bombing. It's going to play out very differently in different parts of the country. In Sana'a, they appear to have escalated strikes on what they consider to be Houthi sites. It's less clear what's happening in Al Hodeida, for instance, which is nominally under Houthi control, said to be under Houthi control, but where there's like no sympathizers with the Houthis among the general population. Situation is different in the third major city in the north, Taiz, where the Houthis and Saleh faced very fierce resistance all along, and then in Aden in the south, it's different again. So in Sana'a, which is the only place I'm really getting any news from today, this morning, it appears that the Saudis are renewing airstrikes, I guess, in order to intimidate people.
And so, what does all this portend for the conflict? I mean, we already have the UN warning that 7 million people are at risk of famine. Saudi Arabia recently intensified the blockade, which already was very intense. There's huge, constant talk of Iran backing the Houthis, even though there's not very much proof, if any proof, that Iran has supplied any heavy weaponry to the Houthis. What is going to happen now that Salah is dead?
Well, I mean, I don't really have a crystal ball, but I could make a couple of comments. One is that if the Iranians were really backing the Houthis, this would certainly be time for them to show it, because the evidence, as you suggest, has been very thin. But if in fact it's an Iranian backed militia that's about to be crushed, then you would expect Iran to do something. I don't know that, I don't particularly expect that they will, because I think the extent of their alliance with the Houthis, also known as Ansar Allah, has been grossly exaggerated from the beginning. In terms of the future of the war, again, it's extremely difficult to predict at this point. But I think what we tend to see happening is, again, the kind of localization or regionalization of the war, so that it would become even harder than it has been in the past year or two or three to speak of one war. We're probably going to be seeing a number of discrete wars in Sana'a, certainly in Taiz, the eastern region, Marib, the Red Sea coast around Hodeida. It looks like there's going to be different wars, and both the Saudis and the Emiratis attempting to buy off local factions in the hopes of having it look as if they have some domestic support, when in point of fact, Hadi, the internationally but not nationally recognized president, has very, very little domestic support.
Finally, Dr. Carapico, the US role. If the US ended its support for the Saudi led coalition, as it's been providing from Obama right through President Trump, what kind of a difference could that make?
Well, it wouldn't make an immediate difference because we've already sold them so many weapons, but it's clear that without American weapons, and in particular, I mean, the most significant American support has, for the most part, been in air refueling of American supplied Saudi fighter jets, which can't fly very far on a tank of fuel because they're such profligate consumers of fuel. If the United States ceased that alone, it would downgrade the Saudi offensive capabilities. If they stopped sending weapons, then over time, again, not this month, but over time, that would also mean that the Saudis would need to de-escalate.
Dr. Sheila Carapico, Yemen specialist at the University of Richmond. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News. It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Mattei. This week, the CBS News program 60 Minutes took an in-depth look at the devastating Saudi-led war on Yemen.
We have managed to get pictures out of Yemen to show you what the Saudi government does not want you to see. This will be hard to watch, but 27 million people in Yemen pray you will not turn away.
But not mentioned by 60 Minutes is that the US government also might not want American viewers to see Yemeni suffering. And that's because the US government has played a vital role in the Saudi war on Yemen since it began, refueling warplanes and supplying the Saudi-led coalition with weapons, intelligence, and diplomatic cover. US naval ships have even backed up the Saudi blockade that has recently intensified and is pushing Yemen to the brink of famine. So why then is the US role being ignored? Well, joining me is Shireen Al-Adimi, Harvard Graduate School student originally from Yemen. Shireen, welcome. Let's start with the 60 Minutes piece. It was a powerful piece of reporting, 13 minutes long, looking at the consequences of the Saudi-led war on Yemeni civilians, but amazingly, not one mention of the US government's key role in supporting this disaster. Your thoughts on that report?
Right. So, here was this one opportunity for the American public to learn about the, neglected war in Yemen. It's not forgotten. It's just deliberately ignored by US media in general for the past 2.5 years. So here was this one opportunity for a mainstream audience to learn about what's going on, and more importantly, how they can help. And within just minutes, I was very disappointed that the 60 Minutes program decided to completely neglect, like you said, the role of the United States in creating this conflict right from the beginning and continuing to support it at its worst, which is the blockade currently.
Right. Let's talk about that blockade briefly. It's intensified in recent weeks after Saudi Arabia accused the Houthi rebels of firing a missile towards Riyadh that was intercepted. What has been the impact of that intensification? And Saudi Arabia just said today that it's going to be easing it a little bit. Do you find that credible?
Not at all. And, they've said in April 2015, they said that they were going to stop bombing Yemen. And here we are in November 2017, and they're still bombing Yemen. So they have very little credibility. And even if they lift the blockade at this point, it's frankly too late to save the not only hundreds, but thousands of lives now who are being lost daily because of this blockade. And even if they lift the blockade, they still remain in power. They're still taking over a sovereign country. They get to decide the fate of 27 million Yemenis as they see fit. And the international community, frankly, should be against this, not supporting it, not backing it as they have done, but completely against this humanitarian crisis that the Saudis have created for no reason.
Right. And in terms of the US media, it's not just 60 Minutes that's been ignoring the US role. Adam Johnson of the group FAIR did a report on this recently, and he pointed out that a number of editorials, including from the Washington Post, have ignored the key US role. But let's talk about that. It began not under President Trump, under President Obama, but it certainly has, it appears to have intensified under Trump. Can you talk about some of the vital support that the US is supplying to the Saudi-led war on Yemen?
So they're helping them in every way possible. The American military is refueling Saudi jets mid-air as they're bombing civilians. And there have been plenty of reports. I mean, it's not a secret that the Saudis are indiscriminate in their targeting. They've targeted hospitals and homes and schools, and it's well documented. And the US military has continued to refuel their jets mid-air. They've provided intelligence. They've provided logistical support. This is besides the weapon deals that we hear about every now and then. So it's not just a weapons deals that the United States is involved in. It's very much, they're hand in hand with the Saudi-led coalition. In Yemen, people see this largely as a US war on Yemen along with Saudi Arabia. So we're very much implicated in this. And senators like Chris Murphy have been saying from day one that the U.S. has fingerprints all over this war in Yemen. It started under Obama, like you said. It continued. It's intensified under Trump. I'm not sure if it's because of Trump or just because of the nature of the conflict. Unfortunately, there's not much acknowledgement of our role. And if there's not an acknowledgement of the role of the U.S., then there's very little hope for American citizens, American residents to actually do something about it, because people just think that this is a famine that's occurring in some faraway land and we have nothing to do with it, or just, people killing people and we have nothing to do with it, when the reality is that we're very much involved. And reports like the Washington Post, which, was labeled as an analysis, didn't even mention the United States one time.
Just to underscore the scale of this crisis and the famine that is looming, if it hasn't begun already in some parts, I want to go to a recent warning from Mark Lowcock, the UN's humanitarian chief, and he issued this warning about Yemen.
There will be a famine in Yemen. It will not be like the famine that we saw in South Sudan earlier in the year, where tens of thousands of people were affected. It will not be like the famine which cost 250,000 people their lives in Somalia in 2011. It will be the largest famine the world has seen for many decades, with millions of victims.
So that's Mark Lowcock, the UN humanitarian chief. Shireen, is it fair to say that the U.S. is also even taking part in the naval blockade of Yemen, because there are U.S. ships patrolling the Red Sea, and it's in the Red Sea that Saudi Arabia has blocked vital supplies from entering the country, from entering Yemen?
Yeah, that's fair. The U.S. Navy has played a part in this blockade, and they've continued to support the Saudi Arabia's efforts in this war regardless. When they want to bomb civilians, they help them. When they want to blockade civilians, they help them. And so they're very much hand in hand, like I said. We are as responsible for this as the Saudis. And like your report said, millions of people are affected. It's not thousands, it's not hundreds, millions. Last year alone, 63,000 children, just children, died because of malnutrition and disease that was totally preventable, diseases like cholera. And this year alone, 50,000 children have already died, and 150,000 more are supposed to die. I mean, I don't know if your listeners or viewers can comprehend these numbers. I certainly can't. These are children that we're talking about that had nothing to do with this. And starvation is being used as a method of war. This is not just a natural famine that's occurring. This is something that people are causing, and many people in the region with support from the United States and the UK are causing.
Shireen, this raises the issue of the death toll. And what we've been hearing for a long time is that the number of dead in Yemen is 10,000. That's the last UN figure that was issued. Now, that figure is at least a year old, and it can't possibly be accurate in a country that, as you say, is ravaged not just by bombings and violence, but also cholera and starvation in many parts. What do you think the actual toll might be?
I'm scared to find out. Many of us Yemenis and people who have been advocating for Yemen are really scared to find out what the real toll of this war is. The United Nations, like you said, was mentioning 10,000 people for a year and a half now. And at some point in the summer, they started saying 5,000 civilians instead of 10,000 civilians. So I don't know where those 5,000 people who were dead went. Yemeni figures on the ground are saying 13,000 civilians have been killed just from the fighting. Not from hunger or diseases or anything like that. And just the recent numbers that we're hearing, 63,000 children dead last year. So how many people died in total, we don't know. And these are not deaths that were accounted for by the airstrikes. This is just as a result of the blockade and the hunger, the starvation, the lack of water. Yemen is running out of water. Major cities have already run out of water, and so people can't hydrate and get clean water to prevent diphtheria and cholera and all these other diseases that we see in 2017 that we shouldn't see.
In terms of what's being done here in the U.S. to oppose the vital U.S. role in this war, I suppose you could say, even though 60 Minutes didn't mention it, that just the fact that it covered Yemen at all was somewhat of a positive step forward, and that it showed the devastation there, even though it didn't tell viewers that their tax dollars were heavily involved. But also there was a House measure last week, non-binding, but passed overwhelmingly, saying that the U.S. does not have authorization from Congress to aid the Saudi-led war on Yemen. Your thoughts on that measure and whether it's a sign of perhaps some momentum on Capitol Hill to oppose the U.S. role?
So that measure, H Resolution 599, was a compromise resolution. And the compromise was occurred because H Concurrent Resolution 81 was stripped of its status as a privileged vote, it's stripped of its privileged status, and it didn't go to vote. That one was introduced by Congressman Ro Khanna in California, and it was supposed to acknowledge the role of the U.S. military in Yemen and to cease hostilities in Yemen, stop aiding the Saudi-led blockade and war in Yemen. And that got knocked down in the House, and instead they put forward, 599, which is very much, like you said, it was non-binding. It was watered down. It grossly overestimated the role of Iran rather than the role of Saudi Arabia. And yes, it passed in the House, but there were no consequences to that. The U.S. military continues to support the Saudis. House Concurrent Resolution 81, if it went through, would have stopped the role of the United States. So yes, there's some action in the House, but they're still very reluctant to take any real measures, any real steps in light of this famine and this cholera outbreak and the devastation. It's really shocking that they continue to ignore our role in this.
Well, that's interesting. So even to pass a measure that was deemed by many people to be critical of the U.S. role, it had to go through all these steps that you outlined to be watered down, including establishing their, as you mentioned, parity between Saudi Arabia and Iran and Yemen. So let's talk about that. When this conflict is discussed, it's taken for granted that this is a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And it's widely accepted that Iran has been supplying major military aid to the Houthis, which seems unlikely, aside from the fact that there's not much proof of it, but the fact that the country can't even get in vital medicines and food because of the blockade. So it seems unlikely that Iran could be sending in missiles to Houthis, to their Houthi allies.
Exactly. There was a secret report that was a UN report that was reported by The Intercept just a couple of weeks ago when the Saudis accused Iranians of sending that missile that targeted Riyadh from Yemen. And the UN report said that there was no evidence that this came from Iran, that it came from within Yemen, as the Houthis have been claiming, as Iran has been saying. They have nothing to do with this. They're not supplying weapons. Yes, there's some sort of relationship between the Houthis and Iran, but when you have the United States, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and all their allies patrolling the Red Sea, blockading every land border between Yemen and its allies and its neighboring countries, and they control the airspace, they control the waters, they control everything. And so to imagine that Iranians are somehow bringing in weapons to Yemen is just absurd. I think it's the most misunderstood conflict to say that it's a proxy war. It's either deliberate distortion of the facts or just lazy journalism by a lot of people who just don't care to look into the actual evidence and the facts. This is not a war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. This is a war between Saudi Arabia and its allies in Yemen. And Yemenis, not just the Houthis, have been resisting, and they refuse to surrender, which is why now they're using this blockade as a last resort to starve people to death so that they can finally surrender to Saudi Arabia.
Right. That confidential UN report that you mentioned also found that Saudi Arabia is preventing the import of supplies that are, quote, civilian in nature, unquote. In other words, denying the country of vital supplies. So finally, being Yemeni in the US, seeing the disparity between the vital role of this government and the level of attention that it's getting, I'm just curious what it's like for you to be here as you're in a country that's playing such a key role in destroying your home country, but that is not being discussed and is being met by so much silence in both the media and political level.
I suppose I know what it feels like to be one of many people here who live here, who have family back home and who see their homes being destroyed by this country, which we work in and we live and we love. Of course, the Americans have nothing to do with this. They largely don't know about it, but our government likes to have these imperialist adventures, and it costs the lives of people. It's devastating. And to not even be able to have an open and honest debate or to have an opportunity to tell people what's going on. 2.5 years into the war, people are still just for the very first time finding out that this is happening in Yemen. It's just honestly heartbreaking. Our tax dollars are being spent to destroy other people's homes, people who have no threat to us, who have never threatened us in any way. It's heartbreaking, it's disheartening, but we just have to continue raising our voices. There are not too many Yemeni people that I know here in Boston, and so I feel the responsibility to just keep going and to keep raising awareness and to keep pushing people toward political action so that we can stop this from, continuing on this course that's been very destructive.
Shireen Aladimi, a Harvard Graduate School student, originally from Yemen, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.